You've probably seen war movies before sweeping battles, gunfire crackling, heroic charges through smoke and chaos. But what if I told you that some of the bravest soldiers in World War II didn't charge with rifles? They crawled on their stomachs, poking the ground with bayonets, praying they didn't hit a mine. And what if I told you that many of them were black men soldiers trained?
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Tested and thrown into the most dangerous job in the Pacific Theater, only to have their names scrubbed from history books for decades. This is the story of the Black Combat Engineers, the invisible giants who fought not with bullets, but with nerve brains and the terrifying patience of men who knew that any wrong move could rip them apart. And yet, almost no one talks about them. Let's set the scene. You're on a hot, wet, miserable island, maybe Leyte, or maybe Bougainville. You've just landed after days at sea. The air smells like rust and rot, and everything's damp. And then you're told you need to clear the road ahead. But it's not just a road. It's mined. The Japanese, on their way out, laced it with explosives, booby traps, and tripwires so fine you can't see them until they've already taken your leg. And your job? Get down on your belly, take a bayonet, and feel the earth, inch by inch. No metal detector. No remote robot. Just you and the dirt dot. Welcome to combat engineering. Black combat engineers were sent ahead of everyone. Before the tanks, before the infantry, before the supply convoys. They were the ones who made the path. Or died trying, and they did die. A lot. These soldiers were doing the exact work you see in thrillers and war documentaries, disarming live mines. Clearing jungle paths under sniper fire, building airstrips with the sound of artillery in the distance. And yet, for years, they weren't even labeled as combat troops. Instead, they were branded as support. Support. As if crawling across a minefield with nothing but a bayonet and guts wasn't real combat. As if facing death daily without firing a single shot somehow didn't count that. Why? Because they were black. The military at the time was still segregated, clinging to the myth that black soldiers weren't fit for combat roles. So even when they fought on the front lines of the most dangerous jobs imaginable, their roles were tucked away in the margins. No medals, no press, no public fanfare. Just quiet, deadly labor in the mud. But make no mistake, these men were warriors. They were trained in explosives. They were taught how to detect traps by instinct, to read the land like a book. Every tree stump might be wired to kill. Every pile of leaves might conceal a mine. They worked in near silence, sometimes with Japanese snipers watching from the tree line. One step wrong, and it was over. Imagine the pressure. Imagine the psychological toll. This wasn't just physically dangerous, it was mentally annihilating. You're lying in the dirt, sweating through your uniform, your hands shaking as you probe the ground. You just watched a buddy get blown up 2 hours ago. And now it's your turn to crawl through the same patch. They had nightmares, tremors, night sweats. Today we call it PTSD. Back then, it was shell shock, or worse, ignored entirely, especially for black soldiers. They were expected to keep quiet, stay tough, and never crack. The truth? Many of them did crack, silently but they kept going. Because if they didn't clear the roads, nobody moved. The whole war effort stalled. Planes couldn't land. Trucks couldn't drive. Medical teams couldn't reach the wounded. The Pacific Theater wasn't like Europe. It was island warfare. Thick jungle, narrow trails, tiny landing strips. Every inch had to be earned, cleared, paved, and built from scratch. And that's what the engineers did. They didn't just disarm mines. They built infrastructure in active war zones. Airstrips on volcanic rock, bridges across rivers rigged with explosives, supply depots under enemy artillery fire. It was dirty, dangerous, grueling work. And yet, they weren't celebrated. They weren't thanked. They were used. Because while they proved again and again that they were as brave, as skilled, and as vital as any white combat unit, They were still treated like second-class soldiers. There's something especially cruel about being given the most dangerous job and the least recognition. They weren't on the front page. They weren't in the parades. They went home in silence if they went home at all. And when they got back, there were no medals waiting, no interviews, no promotions, just Jim Crow. They returned to a country where they couldn't vote freely, couldn't live where they wanted, couldn't even sit at the same lunch counter as the white soldiers they'd fought beside. Or in front of Dot, it's a wound that doesn't heal easily. But here's what makes their story even more remarkable. They still served with pride. They built a legacy in silence. They innovated under pressure, turning standard issue bayonets into mind-probing tools, learning how to read soil texture, detecting pressure plates with the lightest touch. Some of the techniques they developed under fire are still used today. Combat engineering has always been a dangerous job. But in World War II, a specific theater, it became a death sentence, and these men signed up anyway, not because they were blind to the risk, but because they believed that service, even in the shadows, mattered. And now, after decades of being ignored, their story is finally being unearthed. Modern historians are putting the pieces together, pulling reports from archives, tracing the unit histories, and naming the unnamed, because these soldiers weren't just a footnote in someone else's war. They were the war effort. They were the reason the Marines could land. They were the reason the tanks could move without the engineers. There was no invasion. They didn't win battles with rifles. They won them with shovels, saws, and sheer bravery, and they did it while being told. They weren't good enough to fight. That's the kind of heroism that doesn't just deserve recognition, demands it. So next time you hear someone say, Black soldiers didn't see combat in World War II, remember the men who stared death in the face every single day and cleared the way forward anyway. Their battle was against bombs, bullets, and bigotry. And still they pressed on for their country, for each other, for a future where their story might finally be told. This is that story. Now tell it. If this moved you or made you rethink what you thought you knew, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment honoring these forgotten heroes and share their story, because bravery like this doesn't belong in the footnotes. It belongs in bold, Black combat engineers, deep in the jungles of the Pacific, doing the kind of work most soldiers hope they'd never be assigned, or crawling into death traps so that others could march behind them in safety. And when the path exploded beneath one of their own, when a man disappeared in a flash of fire and shrapnel, there was no moment of silence, no ceremony, just a sharp inhale. And the next man stepped forward. That's the kind of courage we're talking about here. They weren't heroes because they had no fear. They were heroes because they knew exactly what waited for them in that soil, and still went forward, over and over again, and they did it while wearing a uniform from a country that treated them like second-class citizens. Think about that. You are trained to protect a nation that won't even let you sit at the front of a bus. You're fighting on the front lines of a war for freedom while being denied basic human rights back home. And still, you show up. You clear the minefields. You build the roads. You make the impossible possible for a military and a government that refuses to even call you a combat soldier. Tell me that's not the definition of unshakable resolve. Let's put it in human terms. Picture yourself in that jungle. It's the middle of the night. Rain is slamming down. You're exhausted, filthy, your hands are trembling, and you're on your belly, inching toward what might be a tripwire. Or a vine, you don't know. There's no flashlight. You're feeling through the mud and praying the ground doesn't blow up beneath you. Every root feels like a booby trap. Every branch could be the last thing you ever touch. And the terrifying part, you have no idea how many mines are left. No map, no clues. The Japanese didn't leave a manual. That's what these engineers lived through. Not just for a day or two, but for months. On campaign after campaign. Saipan, Bougainville, Leyte, Luzon, Okinawa got each. Island brought a new set of horrors. Mines hidden in trees. Tripwires wrapped around corpses. Pressure plates buried under volcanic ash. And always the same marching orders. Clear the way. So they did. They cleared the way so that tanks could roll, so that medics could reach the wounded, so that planes could take off and land. They built runways in the middle of combat zones. They dragged supplies through mud while bullets flew overhead. They constructed bridges across rivers that had been mined to hell, and then they went back and did it all again the next day. But the world back home didn't see any of that. They didn't see the engineer on his knees, tears in his eyes, disarming a trap that just took his friend's life. They didn't hear the prayers whispered through clenched teeth as he pushed his bayonet into the earth. They didn't watch the handshakes between black soldiers who knew that any day could be their last, not because of enemy fire alone, but because their job was the fire. Instead, the headlines called them laborers. Support troops, non-combatants, because if history had admitted how vital these black soldiers were, how lethal their work was, it would have shattered the myth of racial superiority. That was baked into every level of the military structure. And we can't have that, right? Better to downplay the danger. Better to erase the medals they should have received. Better to call their sacrifices something else. Something smaller. It's no coincidence that these stories were buried for decades. Acknowledging their role meant confronting racism not just in society, but in the armed forces themselves. And for a country that was still deep in the grip of segregation, that was a truth it wasn't ready to face. But now we dig them up. Just like those engineers did with the mines, we uncovered the damage, the things people wanted to stay hidden. Because silence is a second wound. And these men already paid with their blood. And here's the thing, they didn't do this alone. These engineer units weren't just a handful of brave men, they were entire companies. Hundreds of soldiers. Many of them barely out of their teens. Some of them pulled from southern towns where they'd never even seen a proper road, let alone a war zone. But they learned, they learned how to build under fire, how to detect pressure plates by feel, how to cut through dense jungle in hours to lay down the landing strip. They became the logistical backbone of the Pacific War, while being treated like they didn't belong in the conversation. No one put them on posters. No one filmed them clearing mines. But without them, the whole machine grinds to a halt. And let's not forget, combat engineering isn't just construction work. It's technical warfare. It's knowing how to identify 15 different types of Japanese ordnance. How to improvise a charge that won't detonate the next 6 mines in a chain. How to rebuild a bridge while an enemy sniper is taking shots from 300 yards out. These were not just brave men. They were brilliant. They were innovators, survivors, trailblazers. And they did it all while being told they couldn't be real soldiers. But they knew the truth. Their comrades knew the truth. And now we need to say it out loud. These men were combat veterans, period. They saw more action than many infantry units. Their casualty rates were staggering. They were awarded fewer honors, not because they did less, but because the system refused to see them. But now, with every record uncovered, every photo found, every family that steps forward with a dusty medal and a fading letter home, the picture becomes clear. The Pacific wasn't just won by flag raisers and fighter pilots. It was won by the quiet hands that cleared the earth. The sweat-soaked soldiers who built the roads and then walked them, hoping they hadn't missed anything. It was won by black men who were told they were second-class citizens and proved in every dangerous step forward that they were anything but. And the fact that their stories remained buried for so long, that's not just an oversight. That's erasure. And erasure is its own kind of violence. So now the question is, what do we do with this history? We tell it loudly. We honor them in textbooks, in documentaries, in memorials. We stop repeating the lie that they weren't in combat. We challenge the lazy narratives that glorify only certain kinds of heroism, because if you ask me, there's nothing more heroic than crawling into the dark with no backup, no spotlight, and no promise of survival, just so someone else can live. That's what these men did. They didn't just serve their country. They saved it. They saved thousands of lives by risking their own. They helped win a war that refused to even salute them properly afterward. But history is catching up. Finally, and we get to be part of that. Reckoning, part of that rewriting. Because the truth isn't just powerful, it's necessary. If we want to understand the cost of war, we have to talk about the men who paid with everything and got nothing in return. If we want to honor courage, we have to look at all the faces that showed it, not just the ones that made the history books so to the black combat engineers of World War II, the silent, steady, brilliant warriors of the Pacific. Your story is no longer forgotten. We see we remember. And we are grateful if this story hit you hard, if it made you think, or feel something you didn't expect. Don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, pass it on, because history doesn't correct itself. We correct it. And for every soldier who crawled into the unknown, so that others could march forward, this is for you. Your bravery was real. Your sacrifice was real. And now, so is your legacy. Let's keep going because there's still more ground to cover. And if we're honoring the legacy of these soldiers, then stopping short just wouldn't feel right. We've talked about the danger, the crawling, the minefields, the silence. But there's another layer to this that deserves the spotlight. Brotherhood. Because when you're in a unit like that doing the kind of work that could kill you every single day, you don't just form friendships. You form a bond, a sacred one. These men weren't just coworkers. They were lifelines. When you're facing the kind of stress that turns your hands into fists in your sleep, when your heart pounds every time your foot hits unfamiliar ground, you need the men around you to be solid, trustworthy, locked in. And that's something everyone who served with these units says. These men had each other's backs, not just in war, but after, because no one else really understood what they'd been through. No one else understood what it felt like to disarm a mine with your bare hands while bullets cracked overhead. No one else understood what it meant to be invisible, even while doing the most visible, high-risk job imaginable. No one else knew the pain of surviving a war and returning to a country that still wouldn't serve you in the same restaurant as the men you saved. And here's what really stings. Many of these men did go home thinking they'd finally earned some kind of respect. That maybe now, finally, their service would mean something. That maybe they could use the GI Bill to buy a home, start a business, build something after the war that wasn't made of blood and mud. But reality hit fast. Black veterans were routinely denied the benefits they'd been promised. Banks wouldn't give them loans. Neighborhoods had racially restrictive covenants. Colleges closed their doors. Employers saw a veteran on a resume and still turned them away when they saw blackface. So while their white counterparts used the post-war years to climb into the middle class, many black veterans, combat engineers included, were left behind, forgotten, struggling, watching from the outside. As a society, they helped lock them out of the prosperity they've earned. That's why telling these stories now matters. Not just to fill in the blanks of history, but to connect the dots between then and now, because the ripple effect of that erasure, it's generational. Imagine what it means when an entire group of veterans is denied recognition, denied benefits, denied a foothold in post-war America. That's stolen opportunity, stolen wealth, stolen pride. And it's not just a personal loss, it's a societal one. The contributions of these black engineers weren't just vital to the war. They were vital to what came after it. Imagine how different things might look if these men had been celebrated instead of sidelined. If their expertise had been harnessed instead of hidden. If their courage had been treated like currency instead of something to politely ignore. Instead, we had decades of silence. Museums that left them out. History books that barely mentioned their existence. Films that cast black soldiers in the background, if at all. Whole generations grew up thinking that black soldiers didn't fight, that they didn't serve in danger zones, that they were cooks and drivers and janitors while others bled in the trenches. But now we know better, and that knowledge, it comes with responsibility. Because here's the thing about legacy. It doesn't maintain itself. It has to be carried. And if you're listening to this, if you've made it this far, you are part of that legacy now. You're a keeper of it. The names of these men may never be carved on every war memorial. They may not be in the textbooks you read growing up, But their fingerprints are all over history. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. You see them in the clear roads of Saipan, in the airstrips of Leyte, in the rebuilt bridges of Okinawa. You see them in every inch of progress that came from the Pacific Theater. Because these men made that progress possible, and they did it. Under fire, literally, they didn't run from danger. They walked into it. Day after day, knowing the odds, knowing the risks, knowing they'd likely never get the credit. That kind of bravery. That's not just military. That's moral. That's spiritual. That's the kind of courage that lives on, even when the history books forget your name.